Hello, my name is Daniel Jones and welcome to my ACR204 assignment, The Murder of SP Bookman William Bob Kent. On November the 8th, 1949, David Clayton, Norman Andrews and Jean Lee were charged for the brutal murder of 73-year-old SP bookmaker William George Kent. William Kent was tried and tortured in the offender's attempt to steal a large sum of money in which he was supposedly keeping on his premises. As a result, William Kent was found strangled and tortured in a Carlton-based lodging house that had been ransacked. This became hotly debated as there were social and political calls to abolish the death penalty, especially in the case of Jean Lee. As a result, the infamous trio were found across various newspapers nationwide over the course of the next 3 years. Throughout all the articles that were published around the murder of William Kent, there was a strong emphasis on the birthplace and age of the offenders. The age of the offenders, which varied from 28 to 35, was highlighted to show the disparity between the offender's youthfulness and the victim's seniority. With this age discrepancy, it showed the difference in strength which would have been present between the elderly Mr. Kent and the three young offenders. The Daily Barrier Truth also made a habit of highlighting the birthplace of the offenders, which in this case they were all from Sydney, to possibly suggest that it was an attack by an external party towards one of our own Victorians. This could potentially cause conflict and prejudice towards the neighbouring state of New South Wales. There was also a strong emphasis on the offender's motive in the Newcastle Sun and the Sydney Morning Herald. By highlighting the motive of theft, the media attempts to enlighten the readers on the selfish nature of the offenders. It stresses to the audience that a man's life was taken so that the trio could obtain a small sum of cash. It was only after death, in an article published by the Illawarra Daily Mercury, were the trio ever humanised. In great detail, the author recounts their last moments as the trio receive religious instructions, and as Clayton and Andrews yell out farewell to each other moments before their execution. Jean Lee was described to have been unconsciously dragged to the scaffold as her hands were tied and face covered. Through this humane article, the publisher reminds the reader that the offenders were still human beings, despite their actions and convictions, therefore putting more weight and bearing on the sentence which was carried out. In the Adelaide Chronicle in November the 10th, 1949, an article titled SP Bookmaker Strangled was published. This title clearly highlights that William Kent held a position and value within society through his occupation. By identifying Mr. Kent through his occupation, the author adds value to the man's life. It also highlights that what was taken from the community was a man with purpose, while potentially connecting Mr. Kent with the audience through a common occupation or relationship. In various articles, there was a strong emphasis on the age of Mr. Kent, as they state he was an elderly 73-year-old. By doing this, the authors further reiterate the fact that Mr. Kent was an ideal victim. With his age comes sympathy, as the media portrays Mr. Kent as a vulnerable, fragile senior who should have been respected and protected by all members of his society. In multiple articles by the Newcastle Sun and the Barrier Daily Truth, Kent's injuries were described in great detail. The Newcastle Sun stated that his hands had been tied with bootlaces, his nose fractured, his face slashed and bruised, his larynx broken, and his stomach and thigh injured. This ultimately can cause mixed feelings within the readers, but as a result of publishing the cruel details of the murder, the media negates all possible feelings of sympathy and leniency towards the offenders. The vivid description paints a gruesome picture, and the media utilizes this in order to potentially persuade readers into accepting the death sentence for the offending trio. In December 1950, the articles regarding the murder of William Kent became rather political, with the Newcastle Sun posting the article "Moved to reprieve Jean Lee" and the Barrier Daily Truth publishing "Victorians endorse Jean Lee's fate." Through the media's constant publications of the sentencing results, it became a political matter, as the Labor Party at the time requested to change the sentence from death to imprisonment for life. In particular, Jean Lee's motion to reprieve was largely founded on the fact that she was a female. This disparity between sentencing that was involved due to a difference in gender is a strong reflection on the 20th century mentality and their cultural values. Unfortunately for the two males charged over the exact same charge, there wasn't such a political and social outcry. Even though the Labor Party's campaigned heavily against the death sentence, the Victorian Cabinet and Privy Council still went forward with the execution, which was in accordance of the public opinion, as a public poll which was conducted in 1948 found that 67% of the Victorian public were in favour of the death penalty when the offence was murder. According to the Barrier Truth, this was the first execution in 10 years, and the trio's death sentence was influenced by an increase in murders in the previous year. The fact that it had been such a long time since an execution occurred in Victoria, it heightened the political tensions revolving around this case. There had not been a female execution in over 50 years, since Emma Williams was sentenced to death for the murder of her 2-year-old in 1895. This case and the media's constant publications caused grave political ramifications and social protests, as the government reassessed their ethical consequences around the death sentence, especially for female offenders. As mentioned earlier, this was the first execution in Victoria of a female offender in over 50 years, and as such, it had major social consequences. The Barrier Truth stated that the average Victorian supported the death sentence, with the minister coming out and saying that he had received very few letters protesting against the decision handed down. This was largely to do with how the media portrayed the trio in previous articles, by highlighting the gruesome details of the murder and by stating the vulnerability of the victims. There was also an evident discrepancy between how a male should have been punished in comparison to a female, as Mrs. Lee received more sympathy from political figures, such as the minister. The execution of the trio will continue to go down in history, especially as Jean Lee became the last female to be given the death sentence in Victoria. Many years after her execution, Jean Lee's story was the subject of a musical called The Hanging of Jean Lee. This is just another form of how society has chosen to portray the story of this historical murder. Thank you very much.